he laughed. That was the part Elena Marlowe could never explain to anyone afterward. Not to her attorney, not to her therapist, not even to herself at 3 in the morning when she lay awake listening to her own heartbeat and her son's. Roman Vescari stood 15 feet away with his back to her, phone pressed against his ear, laughing the way a man laughs when he believes he is completely, permanently safe. Low, easy, almost fond. Elena was 33 weeks pregnant, sitting at the marble kitchen island with her ankles swollen and her lower back burning, and her husband was laughing at something his mistress had said, while Elena held a silver pen above the most important documents she had ever touched in her life. She did not put the pen down. She did not say his name. She sat there and listened to him laugh, and she thought, he actually believes I don't know. If you've ever loved someone who turned out to be a stranger wearing a familiar face, subscribe to this channel right now. That like button. And drop your city or country in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because what Elena does next will change everything you think you know about walking away with nothing. The marble was cold under her forearms. That detail stayed with her later. The specific cold of the stone, the way it held the temperature of a room that had stopped feeling like home months ago. Kitchen was enormous. Everything in the penthouse was enormous. Roman had designed it that way deliberately. Elena understood now, though she hadn't when she'd moved in 3 years ago. Space was power. Square footage was a statement. The bigger the room, the smaller the person standing in it who didn't own it. Elena owned nothing. That was the first thing she had understood when she sat down with Margot Hale 6 weeks ago and spread the documents across Margot's conference table like evidence at a crime scene. Because that was exactly what it was. She owned the furniture she'd brought from her apartment on Com Ave. She owned her clothes, her jewelry, some of which Roman had given her, and therefore probably believed he could take back if he decided to. She owned the silver pen, currently hovering above the signature line of a divorce petition that she had paid for herself in cash, from an account Roman didn't know existed. She had opened that account the same week she'd discovered the first anomaly. It wasn't the affair that broke her. Elena wanted to be clear about that, in her own mind, because she thought it mattered. The sequence of things, the specific order in which her understanding of her marriage had collapsed. The affair was almost incidental. Roman had a mistress. Roman had probably always had a mistress, or something close enough to one that the distinction didn't matter. Elena had understood when she married him that she was not marrying a faithful man. She had told herself that fidelity was a transaction, that what Roman offered in exchange security, position, a last name that opened certain doors that stayed permanently locked for people without it, was worth what she was giving up. She had believed that because she had been 29 and frightened in a way she couldn't articulate, and Roman had been 10 years older, and had seemed like the kind of man who could make the frightening things stop. She had been wrong about that too, but that was a different conversation. The affair wasn't what sent her to Margot Hale. It was the number. $8,400,000. She'd found it by accident. She'd been looking for the receipt for the nursery furniture Roman had insisted on paying for it himself. Some gesture toward the child he seemed to regard as an extension of his empire rather than a human being he was going to be responsible for, and she'd opened the wrong folder on the shared household account. Transfer. A shell company she didn't recognize. A subsidiary of a consulting firm she'd never heard of. Elena was not a forensic accountant. She was a woman who had spent 7 years working in architectural restoration before her pregnancy had slowed her down enough that Roman had suggested, very gently, very firmly, she take some time. But she had grown up watching her father manage 3 small businesses on the margins of solvency, and she knew what money that was trying to hide itself looked like. She had not said anything to Roman. She had taken a photograph of the screen with her personal phone, gone upstairs and sat on the edge of the bathtub for 20 minutes. Then she had called Margot. Roman finished his phone call. Elena heard the shift in his voice, the laugh softening into something more private, something almost tender, and then the quiet of the room when he hung up. She watched his reflection in the dark window above the sink. He was still a handsome man that hadn't changed, broad across the shoulders, dark hair going silver at the temples, in a way that looked expensive rather than old. He stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the harbor lights, and Elena watched him and thought, he has no idea this is the last night he'll spend in this kitchen. believing he's won. "You're up late," Roman said, turning around. "Couldn't sleep." Elena set the pen down beside her water glass, casual. "The baby keeps moving." Roman's eyes went to her stomach the way they always did, brief, acknowledging already somewhere else. He walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. He didn't ask if she wanted anything. "You should try the warm bath thing," he said. "What's the name? That thing your doctor recommended." "Lavender oil." "Right." He poured his water. He didn't look at her. "You have the appointment Thursday?" "Yes. I'll try to make it." He said it the way he always said it. Elena had stopped writing it in the calendar 3 appointments ago. "Eastport meeting goes late." "It's fine," Elena said. "I know you're busy." Roman looked at her then, a quick, assessing look that she had learned to read like weather. He was checking her tone, measuring whether she was building toward something. In the early years of their marriage, she had sometimes built toward things, conversations about what he was working on, where he was going, who he was with. She had learned slowly and then all at once that building toward things with Roman was a form of exposure. Told him what you needed. And Roman Vescari had not built an empire by being generous with people who needed things from him. "You look tired," he said. "I'm 33 weeks pregnant." "Right." He finished his water. He rinsed the glass, set it in the sink, and straightened his cuffs in the gesture she'd seen 10,000 times. "Get some sleep, Elena." He walked past her without touching her shoulder. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. She heard the bedroom door close, not slammed. Roman never slammed doors. Slamming suggested losing control. And Roman Vescari did not lose control. And then the quiet came back, and Elena sat in the enormous kitchen and let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting 3 weeks to leave her body. She picked up the pen. She looked at the signature line. She put the pen back down. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight she still needed one more thing. The story of Elena Marlowe and Roman Vescari was not, from the outside, a story that invited sympathy for Elena. She understood that. She had said, or implied, or carefully not quite said by people who knew them both. She knew what she was getting into. She knew the family. She knew the name. And that was true as far as it went. Elena had grown up in South Boston, daughter of a contractor and a woman who worked bookkeeping for 3 different small businesses simultaneously, and still somehow managed to have dinner on the table most nights. They were not poor. Not technically, but they lived in the specific kind of financial anxiety that doesn't have a bottom you can see, where everything is fine until it isn't, and when it isn't, there is no cushion. Elena had put herself through college on loans and part-time work and a scholarship she'd nearly lost sophomore year when her father's back gave out and she'd spent 2 weeks in Providence helping her mother manage the business chaos. She was smart. She was organized. She had a talent for seeing the structure underneath, things why buildings held up, why they fell down, what made something last, and what made it fail. She'd carried that into her work in architectural restoration, and then, carefully, into her marriage. She had not been naive about Roman. She had understood in broad outline that the Vescari shipping empire had a history that didn't bear too much examination. She had told herself that the history was history, that Roman had moved the family business into legitimacy, mostly that the old connections were ceremonial now, political rather than operational. She had been wrong, but she'd believed it when she married him, and she'd believed it for longer than she should have, and that was the part she found hardest to forgive herself for. Not the believing, the duration of the believing. Margot Hale had an office on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that smelled like good coffee and older money. She was 61, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that came from spending decades in rooms where every word cost something. She had been the independent attorney for the Vescari Legacy Trust for 11 years. She was not Roman's attorney. She was not Elena's attorney. She was technically the trust's attorney, which meant her obligation was to the trust's beneficiaries. And as of the morning Elena had sat across from Margot with a folder of printouts and photographs and a face she was working very hard to keep composed, the trust's most recently documented beneficiary was a child who had not yet been born. Noah. They had chosen the name 3 months ago, on an afternoon when Roman was almost present in the way Elena had still, then, been hoping for. He'd put his hand on her stomach. He'd said the name twice, quietly, like he was testing the weight of it. For about 6 days afterward, Elena had let herself believe that having a child might change something in him, might open some door that had been locked since before she knew him. Days. Then he'd been back on the phone with Celeste Rourke, and Elena had found the second transfer, and the door had closed again permanently. "The trust document is clear," Margot said on that first morning. She had the folder open in front of her and was reading it with her reading glasses pushed down to the end of her nose. The moment a biological child of Roman Vescaris is documented as a beneficiary, which happened when he filed the acknowledgement of paternity 4 months ago, that child has protected interest in the legacy assets. Those assets cannot be transferred, pledged, or encumbered without trustee approval. "Roman knows that," Elena said. "Roman knows that." Margot took her glasses off. And yet, Elena agreed. $8 million is a significant number. Transfers I found are 8.4. I think there's more I haven't found yet. Margot was quiet for a moment. If Roman is moving protected assets knowingly against the beneficiary's interests, the trust agreement gives the trustees authority to suspend his operational control. But we need proof of intent. We need to show he understood what he was doing and did it anyway. Elena thought of the night she'd overheard the phone call. Not the call to Celeste. There had been dozens of those, and Elena had stopped listening carefully to them, because the content was always the same, always another layer of the same humiliation. The other call. The one she'd heard 2 weeks ago when she was supposed to be at her prenatal yoga class, but the instructor had canceled and Elena had come home early and stood in the hallway of the penthouse for 45 seconds listening to her husband say, "Vane can't touch Eastport until the transfer clears, and the transfer doesn't clear until after the divorce is filed." The divorce. Her divorce. Roman was using her divorce as a mechanism in a business deal. Elena had stood in the hallway for another 30 seconds after that. Then she had walked into the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and sat down and thought very carefully about what she was going to do. "I can get you proof of intent," she told Margot. Margot looked at her over the tops of her glasses. "How?" "I'm still his wife," Elena said, "and he still thinks that means I'm not paying attention." Celeste Rourke was not, Elena had decided, a villain. She wanted to be fair about that. Celeste was 31, beautiful in an angular, high-maintenance way. And she worked as a consulting executive for a company that Elena's investigator had eventually traced through 6 layers of shell corporations to a holding entity that did business almost exclusively with Silas Vane's acquisition group. Silas Vane was a different matter. Elena had known the name. Everyone in certain Boston circles knew the name, the way you knew the names of other hazards. Not because you encountered them personally, but because you knew to stay away from the areas where they operated. Vane was in his late 50s, had made his first fortune in distressed asset acquisition during the 2008 collapse, and had spent the following 15 years building a reputation for identifying legitimate businesses under financial pressure and finding ways to increase that pressure until the businesses had no choice but to sell. He was not technically a criminal. That was the thing about Vane that made him more dangerous than the men who operated more overtly. He moved through legal structures the way water moved through rock, not breaking anything, just finding the path through. And Roman Vescari had handed him Eastport Terminal. That was what Elena hadn't understood at first, why Roman would do it. Roman had built Eastport himself, or rebuilt it, had turned a failing mid-century shipping operation into one of the most profitable private terminals on the eastern seaboard. It employed 1,800 people. It was legitimate. It was the thing Roman pointed to when he needed to point to something legitimate. Why would he help someone take it? She'd asked her investigator that question on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the man's cramped Dorchester office while he spread printouts across a folding table. Money, he said, or debt, or both. Explain, Vane had something on him. Some earlier deal that went sideways. Roman needed it buried, and Vane's price for burying it was Eastport. The investigator tapped a page. Celeste's company is the conduit. The $8.4 million is a down payment. It pays for the authentication key that gives Vane access to the acquisition filing. Once the money clears and the key's used, Vane controls the filing, and Roman can't stop it even if he wants to. So Roman helped build the mechanism to take away his own terminal. And he needs the divorce to clear the timeline. If the divorce is filed before the trustees flag the transfers, the protected asset question gets complicated. His lawyers buy him maybe 3 months of confusion. Elena sat with that for a long moment. He planned this before he knew I was going to leave him, she said. The investigator hesitated. It looks like it, yeah. He was going to use me either way. Mrs. Vescari. Elena. It looks like the divorce was going to happen regardless. He just needed it to happen on his schedule. She drove home through the tunnel with the windows up and the radio off and thought about that the whole way. Roman had looked at their marriage and seen a timeline, a mechanism, a variable to be managed. She thought about the night he'd said Noah's name like he was testing the weight of it. He was calculating even then. The recording happened on a Wednesday. Elena had been following Celeste's movements for 2 weeks, not personally, through the investigator, and she knew that Wednesday evenings, Celeste hosted what appeared to be informal business dinners at her apartment in the seaport. Roman attended occasionally. Vane attended occasionally. Elena's investigator had confirmed that both of them were scheduled for this particular Wednesday. Elena told Roman she had a prenatal yoga class. She went to the seaport. She did not think about whether this was a good idea. She had moved past the stage of asking whether things were good ideas. She was asking only whether they were necessary, and this was necessary. Celeste's building had a parking structure with a service elevator that opened onto the floor below Celeste's. Elena had identified this 3 days earlier. She took the elevator to the floor below, found the stairwell, and walked up one flight. The hallway was quiet. She could hear music from behind one of the other doors, something soft and European, someone's dinner party, and from Celeste's apartment the low murmur of voices. The apartment's front door was thick. She couldn't make out words. But the small window beside the door, a narrow panel of glass, decorative, probably original to the building, was cracked open perhaps 2 inches. Elena stood beside it and listened. She heard Roman first because she knew his voice the way she knew her own breathing. He was talking about the timeline. He used the word clean. The filing needs to be clean before the trustees can coordinate, and then Vane said something about the key. Something about making sure Celeste had physical possession before Thursday. And Celeste said something that Elena didn't catch because there was a brief burst of music from the apartment down the hall. Caught enough. She had her phone recording. She had been recording since she got off the elevator. Then Roman said, "The divorce papers are on the table. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She doesn't know what she doesn't know." And Celeste laughed. The laugh was not malicious. That was what made it worse. It was just a woman laughing at a mild joke, comfortable and familiar and slightly bored, the laugh of someone who had heard variations on this observation many times and found it mildly amusing and mostly unremarkable. She doesn't know what she doesn't know. Elena stood in the hallway with her hand pressed flat against the wall and her phone recording, and her son pressing against her ribs from the inside, and she breathed very carefully through her nose until the moment passed. Then she heard footsteps crossing toward the door. She moved. She didn't think about moving her body, just moved. 3 quick steps down the hall and into the alcove near the stairwell door, pressing herself back against the wall. One hand over her mouth, because her breathing had become audible, and she couldn't let it be audible. The apartment door opened. She heard it. She heard Roman's voice, closer now, saying good night to someone, and then the sound of his shoes on the hallway floor. He was walking toward the elevator. He was walking away from her. He passed within 10 feet of the alcove without looking in her direction. Elena did not breathe until she heard the elevator doors close. Then she went down the stairs, through the service entrance, out to her car, and sat behind the wheel for 6 minutes with the engine off before she trusted herself to drive. She had everything she needed. 2 days later, on a Friday that had started like any other Friday, Roman on the phone by 7, the kitchen smelling like the expensive coffee he'd had delivered, the harbor gray and flat through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Elena came downstairs at 9 o'clock with the divorce papers in a manila folder. She set them on the kitchen island. She sat down across from them and waited. Roman came in at 9:15. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. "What's this? Read it," Elena said. He opened the folder. He read the first page with the expression he used when he was reading anything. He hadn't prepared for attention without reaction. The face of a man who had trained himself not to give information away through his expressions. He turned the pages slowly. Elena watched his hands. They were steady. Roman's hands were always steady. He got to the last page. He looked up. No alimony, he said. No. No claim against the business assets? No. You're asking for the trust account for Noah and the Kamav property. Yes, Roman set the folder down. He tilted his head slightly, and Elena recognized the gesture. It was what he did when he was genuinely confused, when something had happened that didn't fit his model of what should be happening. It was the most honest expression she'd ever seen on his face, and it was only visible when he was certain he was the smartest person in the room. Elena, he said, if you think this is... I don't want your money, Roman. She said it simply, no performance in it. I don't want your name. I don't want your business. I want out, and I want Noah protected. That's it. There's someone else. He said it flatly, like a conclusion rather than an accusation. There's no one else. Then why? Because you've been gone for 2 years. She didn't raise her voice. She decided not to raise her voice, not physically. But every other way, you've been gone. And I'm 33 weeks pregnant, and I'm exhausted, and I'm done waiting for you to come back. Roman looked at her for a long moment. She could see him cycling through possibilities. Was this a tactic? Was she building toward a demand? Was there something behind this that he hadn't identified yet? She watched him examine her from the inside out, the way he examined everything, and she held his gaze and gave him nothing, because there was nothing to give him. She had already taken everything she needed. You wanted freedom, she said. Take it. The sentence landed. She watched it land. Watched something move through his expression surprise, then something that might have been wounded if Roman were the kind of man who let himself be wounded, then the specific calculus of a man who was recalibrating. Picked up the pen. He signed. He did it quickly, like he was closing a deal he'd already decided on, and Elena watched his signature cross the page and thought, you just handed me the only weapon I needed. She signed her own copies. She capped her pen. She stood up. I'll have my things collected next week, she said. Elena. He was watching her with that narrow look again, the one that meant his instincts were telling him some things his logic hadn't confirmed yet. Where are you going? A hotel tonight. Then I'll figure out the rest. If you need, I don't, she said. Thank you, Roman. Picked up the folder. She picked up her bag. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button. It stood with her back straight and her breathing even, and she did not look back at him. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was Roman standing at the kitchen island, with the pen still in his hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she realized, riding down through the floors of the building she had lived in for 3 years, that she didn't need to read it anymore. He had signed. She had everything. He just didn't know yet what she was going to do with it. She checked into a hotel on Boylston Street that she had chosen specifically because Roman had no reason to know about it. Not one of the places he used for business clients, not one with connections to anyone in his circle. A mid-range place with a decent restaurant and reliable blackout curtains. She ordered soup from room service and sat at the small desk and called Margot. It's done, she said when Margot picked up. A pause. Signed 40 minutes ago. Another pause longer this time. Elena could hear Margot exhaling. And you have the recording? I'll send it tonight, Elena. Margot's voice had the careful quality it got when she was choosing words the way you chose steps across ice. Once I take this to Vittorio and the trustees, this moves fast. Roman will know by Monday morning at the latest. I know. Are you prepared for that? Elena looked at the window. The city was lit up in the dark, all those lights, all those people in all those buildings who had no idea that somewhere across town a man was probably calling his mistress to tell her that his inconvenient pregnant wife had finally, mercifully, done the sensible thing and walked away without a fight. He signed because he thinks I gave up, Elena said. Let him think that until Monday. And after Monday? She put her hand on her stomach. Noah shifted, a slow roll, one elbow or knee pressing outward, a small body adjusting its position in the limited space it had been given. After Monday, Elena said, we show him what I actually walked away with. She ended the call. She ate half the soup. She lay down on the hotel bed with the lights off and the city coming through the edges of the curtains in thin lines, and she waited for the sleep that didn't come for a long time. In the dark, she ran through the list, recordings, the financial documents, Margot, Vittorio's likely reaction, the trust provisions, the trustee's authority. She ran through it twice, then a third time. She found one gap, the authentication key. She hadn't been able to confirm where Celeste was keeping it, or whether it had already been transferred to Vane. If Vane had the key, the timeline changed. If the key reached Vane before the trustees could freeze the assets. She filed the question in the back of her mind. She would deal with it Monday. She closed her eyes. She breathed. Outside, the city made its city sounds, indifferent and continuous, and Elena Marlowe, who had once been Elena Marsh, from South Boston. Daughter of a contractor and a woman who knew how to hold things together under pressure, lay in a hotel bed 3 weeks before her son was due and thought about all the ways the next 72 hours could go wrong. Then she thought about the moment Roman's pen had crossed that page. Specific scratch of it. You wanted freedom. Take it. She almost smiled. Roman Vescari had spent 20 years learning how to read every room he walked into, every person who sat across from him, every deal that came across his desk. He had built an empire on that ability. He could walk into a negotiation with nothing and walk out with everything, because he understood what people wanted, and he understood how to make them believe they were getting it. He had looked at his pregnant wife sitting at the kitchen island with a folder of divorce papers, and he had seen a woman who had given up. He had seen wrong. But that was the thing about being consistently underestimated. Elena had learned. You stopped fighting it. You started using it. She had been using it for 6 weeks. On Monday morning, Roman Vescari was going to walk into a boardroom and discover that the woman he had written off as an inconvenient variable had spent 6 weeks becoming the most dangerous person in his empire. Not because she wanted his empire, because she wanted it to stop being used as a weapon against the people who depended on it. And because somewhere in the 33 weeks she had spent carrying his child, she had decided that her son was not going to grow up watching his father operate that way. She hadn't taken Roman's empire. She hadn't declared war on him. She had simply signed a piece of paper, the same way he had, and she had walked out of that kitchen carrying everything that mattered. Her hand had been perfectly steady. It still was. Roman Vescari did not call Celeste that night. He called her the next morning, at 6:47, which was earlier than he usually allowed himself to call her, because he had a rule about that, about not being the kind of man who called first, who needed, who reached. The rule had lasted 3 years. He broke it on a Saturday morning, standing at the window of his penthouse kitchen, with the harbor going gray-green below him, and the divorce papers still on the island where Elena had left them, her copies gone, his copies sitting in a neat stack that he hadn't moved since she walked out. Celeste picked up on the second ring. She left, he said. A beat last night? Took 1 bag. Didn't make a scene. He was quiet for a moment. Asked for nothing, except the trust account for the child and that property on Com Ave. Celeste paused. That's less than I expected. That's less than anyone would expect. Roman picked up his coffee cup, put it down without drinking. She didn't negotiate. Didn't threaten. Just put the papers in front of me and said, take it. Roman. Celeste's voice had the careful quality it got when she was managing him, which she thought he didn't notice, and which he had noticed for approximately 2 years. Maybe she's just tired. She's very pregnant. Some women they get to a point where they want it over. Elena doesn't get to points, Roman said. Elena thinks in sequences. Silence on the line. Then you're worried. I'm observant. There's a difference. He didn't answer that. He looked at the harbor. Container ship was moving slowly through the outer channel, lights still on against the early gray, and he watched it and thought about Elena's face when she'd said, you wanted freedom. Take it. The stillness of it, the complete absence of anything he could read. He had been reading people's faces since he was 14 years old, and he had been good at it since he was 17, and he had built his entire operation on that ability, and Elena's face had given him absolutely nothing. That bothered him more than the divorce. The Eastport timeline, he said. Where are we? On schedule. Celeste's voice shifted business now, the warmth dialed back. Key transfer happens Thursday. Vane's team has the acquisition filing ready. Once the key authenticates, it's 48 hours to completion. And the trustees can't move faster than the filing. By the time they identify the asset transfer, the acquisition is complete and there's nothing to freeze. Roman was quiet. Roman, I heard you. It's clean, she said. We've been over this. It's clean. He looked at the divorce papers. She said she doesn't want my money, he said, almost to himself. And you believe her? He picked up the papers, set them down again. I believe she meant it when she said it. Then stop worrying about Elena and let her go. Celeste's voice warmed again, the management back in it. She did exactly what we needed her to do. The timeline is clear. Thursday, everything moves. Roman said nothing. Thursday, he said, right. He ended the call. He stood at the window for another 4 minutes. The container ship had cleared the outer channel. The harbor was empty now, flat and gray and giving nothing back. The boardroom at Vescari Holdings occupied the top floor of a building on Atlantic Avenue that Roman had bought in 2009 and renovated so thoroughly that nothing original remained except the bones. Everything else was Roman's: the long table of dark walnut, the leather chairs, the photographs of ships and terminals and cargo operations going back 3 generations. The photographs were the one concession to history that Roman allowed. He had chosen each of them personally. Vittorio Vescari's photograph was not among them. Vittorio was 74 and had not been active in the business for 11 years, since Roman had bought him out gently, legally, with a settlement that was more than fair and a conversation that had lasted approximately 20 minutes and had never in the years since been discussed again. Vittorio lived in a brownstone on Marlborough Street. He played chess at a club on Newbury Street on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He called Roman on his birthday and at the holidays. He had not called on a Saturday morning since 2015. Roman saw the incoming call at 9:42 and stood in the kitchen for 3 seconds, looking at the screen before he answered. Pop. Roman. Vittorio's voice was what it had always been: careful, specific, the voice of a man who had learned that the wrong word in the wrong moment cost more than silence. Are you home? Yes, I'd like to come by. Roman looked at the divorce papers. Now this afternoon, 2 o'clock, a pause. All right. Good. Another pause, and then, before Roman could say anything else, she came to me, Roman. Kitchen went very quiet. Who came to you? Roman said, though he already knew. Your wife, a beat, your former wife, I suppose, as of yesterday. She came to me 3 weeks ago. I should have called you then. I didn't. Roman's hand tightened on the phone. Why not? Because I needed to understand what I was looking at first. Vittorio's voice remained even, steady, the voice of a man delivering information rather than emotion. 2 o'clock. We'll talk. The call ended. Roman set the phone down on the island, very precisely, in the center of a tile, and stood there with both hands flat on the marble and breathed through the information. She came to me 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Elena had still been sleeping in their bed, still attending his business dinners, still discussing the nursery with the decorator he'd hired. 3 weeks ago, she had smiled at him across a table at the Clarendon Club while he talked to a colleague about port expansion, and he searched his memory of her face that evening. She had looked perfectly composed, interested, present. 3 weeks ago, she had already been talking to his father. Roman picked up his phone. He called his attorney. The call went to voicemail. He called his head of security. That call picked up on the first ring. The Komov property, Roman said. Elena's name is on the lease. I want to know if she's taken anything from the house. Anything unusual. When in the last month? Pull the entry logs. I'll have them in an hour. Roman ended the call. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time looking at the harbor. She doesn't know what she doesn't know. He had said that 2 nights ago, and Celeste had laughed, and he had believed it completely. And somewhere across the city, his former wife had been making moves for 3 weeks that he had not seen, not suspected, not even registered as a possibility. The worst part was not the anger. The anger would come later, clean and useful. The worst part was the specific cold clarity of realizing that someone he had assessed as a manageable variable had been in fact the one doing the assessing. He had been the variable. Margot Hale's office on Saturday afternoon was quiet in the way that offices were only quiet on weekends. A specific stillness, no phone, no movement in the adjacent rooms, the building settling into itself. Elena sat across from Margot with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand and watched Margot read through the recording transcript that Margot's paralegal had spent Friday night preparing. Margot turned the last page. She set it down. This is sufficient, she said, for the trustees, for proof of intent. Roman's own words on that recording demonstrate he understood exactly what he was moving, and that he understood it violated the trust provisions. Margot removed her glasses. What it doesn't resolve is the key. I know, if Celeste already has physical possession, and if she passes it to Vane before we can freeze the assets. Thursday, Elena said. The transfer is Thursday. Celeste takes the key to Vane Thursday. Margot looked at her. You heard that in the recording? I heard enough. The investigator filled in the rest. Elena. Margot's voice had a weight to it that hadn't been there before. If the key reaches Vane and he uses it to authenticate the acquisition filing, we can potentially unwind it, but it takes months. Legal challenges. Appeals. Meanwhile, 1,800 people at Eastport are working for a company that Silas Vane now controls, and Vane's track record with acquired companies is... I know his track record. He strips them. He cuts the workforce, liquidates the benefits, sells the physical assets in pieces, and leaves the shell. Margot tapped the folder. Eastport Terminal doesn't survive Silas Vane. Elena looked at her coffee. She thought about the entry logs she'd requested from the investigator, the records of every vehicle that had cleared the Eastport security gate over the past 3 months, cross-referenced against Vane's known associates. She thought about the 1,800 employees, not as a number but as a list, because the investigator had gotten her the list, names and tenure and department, and she had read through it on Thursday night and stopped at a name she recognized, Frank Delgado. Longshoreman, 22 years of service, the father of a girl she'd gone to school with in South Boston. 22 years. We need to move before Thursday, Elena said. We're moving as fast as the trust structure allows. I've already contacted 2 of the 3 trustees. Vittorio is meeting with Roman this afternoon. Paused. You told him? 3 weeks ago, I told him what I had then. Elena set her coffee down. I don't know where Vittorio lands on this. He's protective of Roman. He hesitated, choosing the word, not stupid. He understands what Roman has done, and what Vittorio did to help create the conditions for it. Elena looked up. Margot met her gaze. I've been the trust's attorney for 11 years, Elena. I know things about the Vescari operations that aren't in any filing. A pause. Celeste Rourke was not unknown to this family before Roman introduced her. Vittorio had used her as an intermediary in at least one earlier transaction. A loyalty test from what I understand. It went sideways. The temperature of the room seemed to change. Elena sat very still. Vittorio used Celeste, she said slowly, and that's how Roman met her. That's my understanding, yes. And Vittorio never told Roman. Vittorio tells Roman what Vittorio decides Roman needs to know. Margot's voice was dry, which has historically been less than the complete picture. Elena stared at the folder on Margot's desk. She thought about Vittorio's brownstone, the chess games, the birthday calls. She thought about the morning she'd walked into his library 3 weeks ago and spread her documents across his reading table and watched his face as he looked at them. The careful, controlled expression of a man processing information he was pretending to see for the first time. Pretending he knew, Elena said, or he suspected. I can't confirm what he knew, Margot said carefully. I can confirm that Vittorio's fingerprints are on more of this situation than he's acknowledged. Elena stood up. She walked to the window. The financial district on a Saturday afternoon was quiet. A handful of pedestrians, a food cart, pigeons on the ledge of the building across the street. Ordinary. Indifferent. He helped create the conditions, Elena said. And then he sat in his brownstone and waited to see how it played out. That's one interpretation. What's another? Margot was quiet for a moment. That he's been waiting for someone to bring him something he couldn't ignore. Something that forced his hand. Elena thought about that. Then let's make sure what he's looking at is impossible to ignore, she said. Vittorio arrived at the penthouse at 2 o'clock exactly, because Vittorio was always exactly on time, which was a form of control he had never relinquished even in retirement. He was a smaller man than Roman in every physical dimension, shorter, lighter, less immediately imposing, but he had the kind of stillness that made rooms orient around him. And when he sat down across from Roman at the long kitchen island and folded his hands on the marble, Roman felt, despite everything, like he was 17 again. He hated that. Show me what she brought you, Roman said. No. Roman looked at him. I'm not here to show you Elena's evidence, Vittorio said. I'm here to tell you that I've seen it, and that it's sufficient, and that the trustees are being contacted. I'm the operational authority of the trust, you were, Vittorio said. The word was quiet. It landed like a stone. The trust agreement is clear, Roman. If a trustee presents documented evidence of intentional harm to a beneficiary's protected interest, operational authority can be suspended pending review. That review is being requested. He paused, by me. Roman's jaw tightened. You're doing this. What you did yourself. I'm responding to it. I built that company. Roman's voice stayed level, but something beneath the level quality had gone taut. I built Eastport from nothing. I turned a failing operation into a company that employs 1,800 people who did not agree to become leverage in your arrangement with Silas Vane. Vittorio's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Do you know how many of those workers have been with Eastport for more than 15 years? Roman said nothing. 412, Vittorio said. I had someone pull the numbers. You had someone... Roman stopped. He looked at his father. He looked at him the way he hadn't looked at him in years. Not as a retired patriarch to be managed, but as a man, specific and complicated and capable of independent action. How long have you been pulling numbers? Vittorio met his eyes. Long enough. The silence between them had texture years of it. Things said and not said. The specific weight of a father and son who loved each other in the particular way of men who never found a language for it, and so had filled the space with operations and authority and the management of each other's expectations. You should have come to me, Roman said, when Elena brought you this. You should have called me, and you would have... What, stopped? Vittorio looked at him steadily. Or made it cleaner. Roman didn't answer. That's why I didn't call you, Vittorio said. Roman stood up. He walked to the window, the same window he'd stood at that morning, the harbor unchanged, indifferent, and he put his hands in his pockets and breathed. Vane has to be stopped, Vittorio said from behind him. Not because of the trust, not because of the legal exposure. Because of what he'll do to Eastport. You know what he'll do. I know. Then help stop it. It's not that simple. It never is. Vittorio's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. The choice is still yours for now. A pause. By Monday morning, it may not be. Roman turned around. Vittorio was already moving toward the elevator. Pop! Vittorio stopped. The Celeste situation, Roman said. Before Elena. Before all of this, he watched his father's shoulders. Particular tension in them. You knew her. A long silence. We've all made choices, Vittorio said, that we convinced ourselves were strategic. He pressed the elevator button. The difference between you and me is that mine didn't put 1,800 people's livelihoods on the table. The doors opened. I'll see myself out. The doors closed. Roman stood in the kitchen alone and thought about what his father had not said, which was yes. Celeste received Roman's call at 4:15. She was at her seaport apartment, the same apartment, sitting in the same chair where she'd sat 2 nights ago when... Stop that thought. Something's wrong, Roman said without preamble. My father met with Elena. The trustees are being contacted. Celeste set her glass down. How fast? I don't know. Fast enough. His voice had changed. She had known Roman for 3 years, and she knew every frequency of his voice, and this frequency low, stripped of the usual surface confidence, was the one she had heard only twice before. Thursday timeline may not hold. Vane needs to know. I know Vane needs to know, Roman. She kept her voice steady. If we accelerate the key transfer, if I take it to Vane tonight instead of Thursday. Tonight is too fast. The authentication needs the acquisition filing to be in position. Vane's team isn't ready until Wednesday at the earliest. Then Wednesday. Elena has recordings, Celeste. The air in the apartment changed. What recordings? Celeste said. The meeting. Here Wednesday night. His voice was very quiet now. She was in the building. Celeste looked at the window of her apartment. At the narrow decorative panel beside the front door that she had always meant to replace because it was original to the building, and original to the building meant drafty, and... She closed her eyes briefly. How much did she get, she said. Enough, my voice. Your Vane's name, the Eastport timeline. A pause. She's had it for 2 days, which means Margot Hale has had it for 2 days. Celeste stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the harbor. The same harbor Roman was probably looking at from a different angle, from a different building. Both of them standing at their respective windows, looking at the same gray water and processing the same information from different directions. The key is in my safe, she said. It's been there since Roman gave it to me for safekeeping. I need you to keep it there until I figure out how to. Roman. She said his name carefully, like she was setting something down on a surface she wasn't sure would hold it. The trustees moved to freeze the assets before the key is used. It becomes evidence. It becomes part of the theft investigation. And at that point, the key is a chain running directly from the safe in my apartment to a federal criminal filing. Silence. I can't have that chain in my apartment, Celeste said. Celeste, I'm not going to prison for Silas Vane's acquisition deal. Her voice had changed, too, the warmth gone, the management gone, something colder and more essential underneath. I agreed to be a conduit. I agreed to hold the key and facilitate the transfer on Thursday. I did not agree to hold evidence in my apartment while the trustees and the FBI build a case. The FBI isn't, not yet, she said. But you just told me that Elena Marlowe has been recording conversations and bringing evidence to trustees and apparently coordinating with attorneys for 3 weeks while you thought she was going prenatal. Appointments and picking out nursery furniture. A pause. Does that sound like a woman who isn't going to involve the federal authorities? The silence this time was different, heavier. I need more time, Roman said. I need the key out of my apartment, Celeste said. Tonight. Where are Vane's people? Give it to Vane's people and let him deal with the timing. If Vane has the key early, he can move before we've covered the asset trail. Roman, her voice was flat now. I need it out of my apartment. Tonight. You figure out the rest. She ended the call. She stood at the window with her phone in her hand and her heart doing something fast and unpleasant in her chest. And she thought about the recording. About her own voice saying, it's clean. We've been over this. It's clean. About the way Roman had said she doesn't know what she doesn't know, and she had laughed. She had actually laughed. And somewhere outside that door, in the hallway, Elena Marlowe had been standing against the wall with her phone recording every word. Celeste was not a person who frightened easily. She had made her way through structures that were not designed to make space for her, and she had done it by being useful and adaptable and clear-eyed about what she was involved in and what the risks were. She had not been clear-eyed about this. She had let Roman's certainty become her certainty, and Roman's certainty had been built on a foundation that was apparently hollow. She opened her safe. She looked at the authentication key, a small black device the size and weight of an ordinary USB drive that could authorize the transfer of a $100 million acquisition with a single connection. She thought about prison. She thought about Sissa Vane, who had not built his empire by protecting the people who became liabilities. She picked up her phone and called a number she'd only used twice before. Vane answered on the third ring. I need to move the key tonight, Celeste said. Pause. That's not the timeline. The timeline is compromised. Roman's wife has recordings. The trustees are moving. She kept her voice even. If I hold this until Thursday, I hold evidence until Thursday. I'm not doing that. Another pause longer. She could hear Vane breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of a man who was processing information and did not rush. Bring it to the harbor terminal, he said finally. The Eastport loading dock, east entrance. Tonight at 11. Celeste hesitated. Eastport itself? The acquisition documents are already positioned there. The fastest authentication point. If Roman finds out, Roman, Vane said, with a particular quietness, is no longer the relevant variable in this equation. Call ended. Celeste stood in her apartment for a long moment. Then she put the key in her coat pocket, and she went to get her car keys, and she did not call Roman back. Elena's phone rang at 7:41. She was in her hotel room, lying on the bed with her shoes off, and her notes spread around her, and she reached for the phone and saw the investigator's name and sat up. Talk to me, she said. I've got movement on Celeste Rourke. The investigator's voice was compressed quick. She left the Seaport apartment 40 minutes ago. She's driving south on 93. Elena went still. South on 93 means the harbor district, she said. Yeah, she has the key. I can't confirm. She has the key and she's moving it early. Elena was already off the bed, already reaching for her shoes. Where is she now? Coming up on the exit for the waterfront industrial. She's going to Eastport. Elena put her shoe on, then the other. She stood up and looked at the room, the notes, the folders, the coffee cups, the evidence of 6 weeks of quiet work, and she thought about the authentication key and the 1,800 names on the Eastport employee list, and Frank Delgado with 22 years of service. She picked up her phone and called Margot. The key is moving tonight. Elena said when Margot picked up. Celeste is bringing it to Eastport. We have maybe 4 hours before Vane authenticates the acquisition. A sharp breath on the other end. Elena, if Vane authenticates tonight, then the trustee's freeze means nothing. I know. Elena grabbed her coat. Call whoever you need to call. Federal Trust Authority. Whoever. But do it now. Elena Margot's voice was careful. Where are you going? Elena looked at the door of the hotel room. She thought about Noah, rolling slowly inside her, one elbow pressing out. She thought about Roman's pen crossing the divorce papers, that clean, decisive scratch. She thought about Vittorio's voice saying the choice is still yours for now. I'm going to make sure Roman has to make a choice, she said. She walked out of the hotel room and into the hallway, and the elevator was already open, and she stepped in and pressed the lobby button. And as the doors closed, she understood, with the specific clarity of a person who has crossed a line they cannot uncross, that whatever happened in the next 4 hours was going to determine everything that came after. There was no version of tonight that left things the way they had been. She had known that when she sat down at that kitchen island with the silver pen. She had just thought she'd have more time. The cab let Elena out 2 blocks from the Eastport perimeter at 10:43. She had not driven herself. She had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds in the hotel lobby before deciding that driving in her condition, at night, in the state she was currently in, was the kind of decision that looked reasonable until it wasn't. The cab driver had glanced at her in the rearview mirror twice during the ride, at her coat, at the unmistakable silhouette of her pregnancy beneath it, and had said nothing, which she appreciated. The harbor district at this hour was its own particular silence. Not empty. There were trucks on the access road, a security light burning orange above the main gate, the distant mechanical sound of something being loaded or unloaded somewhere further along the waterfront. But the human noise was minimal, and the dark between the light sources was deep, and smelled like salt water and diesel, and the specific cold of a coastal city in early spring that hadn't decided yet whether winter was finished with it. Elena stood on the sidewalk and looked at the Eastport gate and thought about what she was doing. She was 33 weeks pregnant. She was standing outside a working cargo terminal at 10:03 on a Saturday night because her instincts had told her to move, and she had moved, and now she was here, and her instincts were telling her that being here was not the same as having a plan. Her phone buzzed, the investigator. She's inside, he said. Celeste's car cleared the east entrance 8 minutes ago. I couldn't follow without credentials. Who's with her? Couldn't confirm. The vehicle that waved her through, it's registered to a logistics company that Vane's group uses as a front. So Vane's people are already on site. Elena looked at the gate. A single guard in a booth, reading something, not watching the road. Margot, she said. Have you talked to Margot? She called me 20 minutes ago. The federal contact she has is making calls. But it's Saturday night, Elena. The fastest they can get a warrant to a judge and get agents to this location is. He paused. Not tonight. Maybe not before midnight tomorrow. The authentication happens tonight. I know. So by the time federal agents arrive, the acquisition is complete and Vane controls the filing. Silence. I need to get inside, Elena said. Absolutely not. There has to be a way to delay the authentication. If someone can physically interrupt the process, Elena. His voice had the particular quality of a man, trying to be patient with someone who was not going to be patient. You are 33 weeks pregnant. You are not going into a cargo terminal at 11 o'clock at night to interrupt a transaction being managed by Silas Vane's people. Then tell me another option. He didn't answer immediately. That pause told her everything. Roman, she said. What? Roman is the one person who has standing to walk through that gate without a warrant. Eastport is still legally his operation until the trustee's suspension is formally filed, and Margot said that filing isn't complete until Monday. She was thinking out loud now, the sequence assembling itself, the way structural problems assemble themselves when she stood in front of a failing building and let her eyes find the load path. If Roman goes in there and physically revokes Celeste's access, if he confronts Vane directly and refuses to authorize, he'd be walking into a room with Silas Vane and Vane's people and announcing that the deal is off. Yes, that's not a safe situation, no, Elena said. It isn't. Another silence. You'd have to call him, the investigator said. Elena was already pulling up Roman's number. Roman answered on the first ring, which told her he hadn't slept. Celeste took the key to Eastport, Elena said, without introduction. She's there now. Vane's people are on site. They're going to authenticate tonight. 3 seconds of silence. How do you know this? Roman said. Because I've had someone watching Celeste for 2 weeks. She kept her voice flat. This was not the moment for anything else. The federal process is too slow. The trustees' filing isn't complete until Monday. If the authentication goes through tonight, there is no legal mechanism fast enough to stop the acquisition from completing. She heard his breathing change. You need to go in there, she said. You need to physically revoke her access and pull the key before Vane uses it. Elena, you're still the operational authority. Until Monday, that's still your name on the Eastport management filing. If you walk in there and you tell your security team that Celeste Verka does not have authorization to be on the premises. My security team. His voice had something in it she couldn't quite read. You think my security team is going to override Vane's people? I think you need to try silence, longer this time. Why are you doing this? Roman said. The question landed differently than she expected. Not hostile, not suspicious, or not only suspicious. A selson underneath it, a genuine asking, the voice of a man who had been certain he understood a situation and was now standing in the rubble of that certainty. Because 1,800 people work at Eastport, Elena said. And Vane will strip it in 18 months. That's not the only reason. She was quiet for a moment. The harbor wind moved through the gap between the buildings, cold and specific. No, she said. It's not the only reason. Then what's the other one? Noah's trust is tied to that operation. If Eastport collapses under Vane, the trust loses half its asset base. She paused. I didn't protect the trust for 6 weeks to watch it get hollowed out. She heard Roman exhale, a long, slow exhale like something releasing. Where are you? He said. 2 blocks from the east gate. Elena. His voice changed. You're at Eastport. I'm on the sidewalk. You're 33 weeks. I know what I am, Roman. She said it without heat. Are you coming or not? A pause. Then, don't go through the gate. Stay on the street. Roman. Elena. The word had a weight to it that was different from his usual authority. Not command, something closer to a request. Please, stay on the street. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call. Elena stood on the sidewalk and looked at the gate and breathed. 20 minutes. She looked at her phone. 10:51. If Vane's people were already on site, if Celeste had the key, if the acquisition documents were positioned at the terminal, as Vane had told Celeste, 20 minutes might be enough. It might not be. She put her phone in her pocket and walked toward the gate. The security guard in the booth was named Patterson. She could see his name badge when she reached the window. He was in his 50s, broad across the shoulders, with the specific look of a man who had worked security at the same facility, for long enough that most nights were interchangeable. Tonight was not interchangeable. Patterson looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to see a visibly pregnant woman at his gate at 10:55 on a Saturday night, and was now rapidly recalibrating what kind of night this was going to be. Ma'am, he said, this is a restricted facility. I know, Elena kept her voice steady. My name is Elena Vescari. My husband is Roman Vescari, the operational director of this terminal. Former wife, said a voice behind her. She turned. She had not heard the car. It was a dark sedan, parked half on the access road 20 feet back, and the man leaning against the passenger door was not someone she recognized immediately. Tall, pale complexioned, with a particular quality of stillness that she associated with men who were paid to be effective rather than reassuring. Behind him, from the driver's side, Silas Vane stepped out. She had seen photographs. Photographs had not prepared her for the specific quality of his presence, the way he moved without hurry, without performance. A man completely at home in a situation most people would find threatening, because he had arranged the situation himself and therefore already knew how it ended. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, wearing a coat that had cost more than Elena's monthly rent in the South Boston apartment she'd had at 26. He looked at her, the way you looked at something you'd heard about, but hadn't expected to encounter in person. Mrs. Vescari, he said. Or Marlowe, I suppose, as of yesterday. Elena did not move. Mr. Vane, she said. You've caused a considerable amount of disruption, he said pleasantly without edge. For someone who was supposed to be taking a hotel room and recovering from her divorce. I'm a light sleeper. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. He took 3 steps toward her, and the man from the passenger door moved with him, half a step behind, and Patterson in the booth was very still. "You have recordings," Vane said, "Roman's conversations." "Mine, you've been very thorough." He tilted his head. "Question is whether thorough is sufficient. The trustees are filing Monday." Monday. He said the word the way you said a word when its meaning had changed. "By Monday morning, the authentication is complete. The acquisition is filed. The legal challenge process take." He paused. "Let's call it 18 months, during which Eastport continues to operate, during which Roman's very compromised position makes him an unreliable challenger, during which your evidence, while compelling, works its way through a process that I employ very good attorneys to make as slow as possible." Elena looked at him. "You've done this before," she said. "Several times, and it's worked every time." He met her gaze. He was not threatening her. She understood. He was explaining. There was a particular kind of arrogance that expressed itself as explanation. The arrogance of a man who believed the truth of his power was itself the most effective tool he had. "I don't need to do anything to you, Ms. Marlowe. I don't need to threaten you. I need you to understand that what you've set in motion is not sufficient to stop what's already in motion." A pause. "Go back to your hotel. Have your baby. Let the legal process run. And the 1,800 employees will have jobs during the legal process. Afterward," he lifted one shoulder, "restructuring is sometimes necessary." "You'll strip it," Elena said. "I'll optimize it." She looked at him for a long moment. At the pale, specific face of a man who had spent decades doing this, identifying pressure points, applying pressure, walking away with what he'd come for, and who had looked at Eastport Terminal and its 1,800 workers and seen an optimization opportunity. She thought about Frank Delgado, 22 years. "You need the key to authenticate," she said, "and Celeste has the key." "Celeste is inside," Vane said. "She's been inside for 15 minutes. "Then why are you still out here?" Something shifted. Smallest thing, a fractional tightening around his eyes, a pause that was a quarter second too long. "Because I wanted to speak with you first," he said. "No," Elena said, "because something has gone wrong inside, and you came out to wait." Pause this time was longer, and in that pause, Elena's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. "The investigator. Call me now." She looked up at Vane. "Excuse me," she said, and she stepped back 3 paces and answered the call. "What?" she said quietly. "The key." The investigator's voice was compressed fast. "I've been monitoring the terminal's internal security feed. I had a contact pull it." Celeste went to the loading dock storage room, where the acquisition documents were staged. But the authentication terminal, the device that reads the key, it's not there. "What do you mean it's not there?" "It was moved. Sometime in the last 6 hours, someone moved the authentication terminal from the loading dock to the main operations office, which is on the other side of the terminal, which requires a different access code." A pause. "Code that Celeste doesn't have." Elena turned slightly away from Vane. "Who moved it?" "The access logs show a terminal administrator code." "Code," the investigator paused. "Elena, the code belongs to Patterson. Security guard on the east gate." She glanced back at the booth. Patterson, who was sitting very still, watching the exchange between Elena and Vane, with an expression that was no longer the expression of a man who hadn't expected an unusual night. "He moved it," Elena said quietly. "Someone told him to move it. The log timestamp is 4:17 this afternoon." A beat. 3 hours after Vittorio left the penthouse, Elena stood on the access road outside Eastport Terminal at 10:58 on a Saturday night and understood what she was looking at. Vittorio. Vittorio, who had been pulling numbers for long enough, who had known Celeste before Roman knew her, who had told Roman the choice is still yours for now, who had sat across from Elena 3 weeks ago in his library and listened to her spread her evidence across his reading table with the expression of a man seeing something for the first time. Except he hadn't been seeing it for the first time. He had been deciding, and sometime this afternoon, after leaving the penthouse, he had made a call that moved an authentication terminal across a cargo facility and trapped Celeste Rourke on the wrong side of an access code, which meant the key she was carrying was currently useless, which meant Vane's authentication timeline was broken, which meant Vittorio had sabotaged his own son's deal before the trustees could. Elena. the investigator's voice. "Are you there?" "I'm here. There's something else," she waited. "The archive," he said. "The financial documentation Roman's transfers, the shell corporations, all of it. Been compiled into a complete package. I don't know by who. But it's been transmitted to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Timestamp is 6:03 this afternoon." Elena closed her eyes. Vittorio had not just sabotaged the key, he had sent the evidence himself. He had not waited for Monday. He had not waited for the trustees. He had taken the documentation that Elena had given him 3 weeks ago, compiled it with whatever else he'd been gathering independently, and transmitted it to federal investigators on a Saturday afternoon, while his son was standing at a penthouse window, looking at the harbor. She opened her eyes. She turned around. Vane was watching her. He had understood from her face that something had shifted. He was very good at reading faces. She could see him processing, recalibrating, the pleasant explanatory quality gone now, something colder and more operational underneath. "The authentication terminal has been moved," Elena said. "Celeste can't complete the authorization." Vane's jaw tightened. One small movement. "The FBI has the financial archive," she said it quietly, not for effect. Just as information, the way Margot said things. As of 6 o'clock this evening, the silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had a different quality, not the silence of a man thinking, but the silence of a man who was running calculations and not liking the outputs. "It's not possible," Vane said. "The archive was transmitted this afternoon. Your acquisition filing is already flagged." Elena looked at him. "The legal challenge process you mentioned, the 18 months, that process starts differently when it begins with a federal financial crimes investigation rather than a civil trust dispute." Vane looked at her for a long moment, at her coat, at her pregnancy, at the phone in her hand, at the gate behind her, where Patterson was still sitting, very still. "Who sent it?" Vane said. "Someone who's been watching this longer than either of us," Elena said. The dark sedan's engine was still running. Elena noticed it now, the low idle of it, the exhaust in the cold air. The man from the passenger door had not moved, but his posture had changed, the particular shift of a person receiving new information and adjusting. Vane turned to the man. Something passed between them. No words, just a look. And the man opened the passenger door. "Ms. Marlowe," Vane said, turning back. The pleasantness was completely gone now. What was underneath it was not rage. It was something more controlled, and therefore more frightening. "I want you to understand something. The federal process is slow. The investigation will proceed. I will have attorneys engaged by Monday morning. And whatever your former father-in-law believes he has accomplished tonight." Headlights swept across the access road. Roman's car came through the outer gate at speed, not reckless but fast, with the specific purposefulness of a man who had driven this route 1,000 times and knew exactly where every inch of it went. It stopped 15 feet from where Elena was standing. Roman got out. He looked at Elena first. A single fast assessment her face, her posture, the way she was standing. Then he looked at Vane. The two men looked at each other. Elena had tried to imagine what this confrontation would look like. She had not imagined it here on an access road in the harbor cold, with herself standing between them. "Silas," Roman said. Roman. Vane's voice had regained its surface quality, the pleasantness back in place, thinner now, the mechanics of it more visible. "This has gotten complicated." "Yes," Roman said, "it has. Your father appears to have—" "I know what my father did." Roman walked forward. Not toward Vane, toward Elena. He stopped beside her. He looked at her for a moment that Elena couldn't fully read. Not the usual assessment, something more direct than that. Something that had dropped the several layers of management he usually kept between himself and the people around him. "You okay?" he said quietly. "Yes." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned to face Vane. "The key is inside," Roman said. "And the authentication terminal is on the other side of a door that my security team controls." He paused. "Not your security team, mine, Roman." Vane's voice was very quiet. "Think carefully." "I've been thinking carefully for 2 years," Roman said. "I've been thinking carefully since you came to me with your offer, and I decided that the smart move was to let you use Eastport as a chip in a deal I should have walked away from." He reached into his jacket. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the Eastport operations manager. He'll secure the building. Celeste stays inside until she turns over the key. and your people. He looked at the man by the sedan. People leave. The acquisition filing is going to be the least of your problems, Roman said when the FBI's Financial Crimes Division finishes reviewing what my father sent them this afternoon. Something moved through Vane's expression. A series of calculations running, fast and visible, the way calculations became visible when the comfortable margin of certainty disappeared. You're confessing to the trust violations, Vanes said. You understand that. Everything you just said. I know, Roman said. He made the call. He stood on the access road next to his former wife and called his operations manager and said 4 sentences in the flat, specific voice he used when he was giving instructions he expected to be followed immediately. He ended the call. He put the phone back in his pocket. Vane looked at him for a long moment. Then Vane looked at Elena. You built something here, he said to her. He said it without particular emotion. 6 weeks alone. He almost seemed to mean it as a compliment. Elena said nothing. Vane walked to the sedan. The other man was already in the passenger seat. Vane got in the driver's side. The car turned on the access road and moved toward the outer gate. Elena watched it go. Beside her, Roman let out a breath that she felt more than heard a long, ragged exhale, like something structural giving way. The FBI, he said. Yes, my father, yes. Roman was quiet for a moment. I didn't know he had that documentation. I gave him mine 3 weeks ago. He had his own. He'd been watching longer than either of us knew. She paused. He used Celeste. Before you knew her. She used her as an intermediary in an older deal. That's how you met her. Roman turned his head to look at her. He told you that, he said. Margot told me. Roman looked back at the gate. Patterson's booth. The orange security light burning above it. He helped create the conditions, Roman said slowly. Yes. And then he watched. Yes, and then he burned it down. Elena looked at him. At the specific exhaustion in his face. Not the surface management kind, but something deeper. The exhaustion of a man who had spent 20 years being certain and had arrived at a night on a cargo access road where every certainty was gone. He burned the parts that were already burning, she said. What happens to you now? That's the part you did yourself. Roman was quiet for a long time. Inside the terminal, she could hear the sound of voices. Her phone was ringing, the investigator again, and she answered it and listened, and what he told her made her close her eyes for 3 seconds. What? Roman said, watching her face. She lowered the phone. Celeste, Elena said. When your operations manager secured the building, Celeste was in the main corridor. The access code door. She paused. She didn't have the key on her. Roman went very still. She must have given it to someone inside before the building was secured, Elena said. Someone already inside Eastport. Someone Vane had positioned before tonight. She looked at Roman. The key is still inside the terminal, in someone else's hands. And we don't know who. The orange light above the gate flickered once. Roman's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed in a way Elena had never seen his face change. Not shock, because Roman didn't shock. But the specific expression of a man who has looked at the name on his phone and understood that the world he'd been operating in for 20 years has just ended, and whatever comes next is something he has no map for. He showed her the screen. It was Vittorio's number. But beneath the name, a message had come through. In the seconds before the call, Roman. Sorry, there is something I haven't told you. The archive I sent to the FBI tonight, it contains documentation of my own transactions. Not just yours. I have been part of this longer than I told Elena. Longer than I told anyone. The federal investigation will reach me too. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Roman stared at the screen. The phone kept ringing. Elena looked at the message. The name at the top. At Roman's hands, which were, for the first time in 3 years, not completely steady. The authentication key was somewhere inside the terminal. The FBI had an archive that implicated both Roman and Vittorio. Vane was gone, but not finished. Celeste was inside without the key, which meant she had passed it to someone neither of them could identify. And Roman Vascari was standing on an access road in the harbor, cold with his former wife beside him, holding a ringing phone, looking at a message from his father that had just collapsed the last wall standing. He answered the call. Pop, he said. His voice, for the first time in as long as Elena had known him, sounded exactly like what it was. The voice of a man with nowhere left to stand except where he was. Roman talked to his father for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Elena counted. Not deliberately, she was watching the gate, watching the terminal lights, watching the access road for any movement that shouldn't be there. But the counting happened anyway. The way her mind had always done its quieter work, underneath. Whatever she was supposed to be focused on. 4 minutes and 30 seconds of Roman standing 3 feet away from her on the cold access road, with the phone pressed to his ear, and his free hand in his coat pocket, and his face doing something she had never seen his face do in 3 years of marriage. He was listening, not the performance of listening, not the slight nod, and the forward lean he used in business meetings. When he wanted someone to believe, he was absorbing their point while actually preparing his counter. Actual listening. The kind that required you to stop constructing a response and just receive what was coming through the line. She heard Vittorio's voice as a sound without words, low, deliberate, the specific cadence of a man making a confession he had rehearsed. Roman said almost nothing. 3 words. Somewhere in the second minute. How long, Pop? Then silence again. Then, near the end, I understand. Then he ended the call and stood with the phone at his side and looked at the orange light above the gate for a long time. 31 years, he said finally. Elena waited. He's been running a secondary ledger alongside the legitimate operations for 31 years. Money in, money positioned, favors traded. Not at the scale I was running. Smaller, more careful. Roman's voice was flat in the specific way of a man delivering information he hadn't processed yet, because processing it would require stopping, and he couldn't stop. Celeste was his. He used her 3 times. Different intermediary roles, different deals. He introduced her into my orbit deliberately. He thought she'd be a check on my ambitions. Someone close to me who ultimately answered to him. Elena closed her eyes briefly. Instead, Roman said she saw what I was building and decided she'd rather work with Vane than answer to my father. And Vittorio didn't know. He knew she'd shifted. He didn't know how far. Roman finally turned to look at Elena. He sent the Federal Archive tonight because he understood that if Vane completes the acquisition, Celeste walks away and his own exposure in the secondary ledger becomes collateral damage in a federal investigation he didn't control. A pause. He burned the building to make sure he was the one who called the fire department. Protected himself. He protected himself. Roman looked back at the gate, and he told me it was because of the 1,800 workers. Elena said nothing. Maybe it was both, Roman said. I don't know. I used to think I could read him. Her phone buzzed. The investigator, security camera, loading Dock B. Someone moving toward the east corridor. Male not Celeste. Has something in his hand. She showed Roman the message. He read it once. He looked up. Something in his face consolidated. The open, stripped quality closing back down. Not into the old management, but into something more functional. Not Roman the empire builder. Roman the man who knew this facility, its corridors and access points, and the specific vulnerabilities of a working cargo terminal at 11 o'clock at night. Loading Dock B connects to the operations corridor through a fire access door, he said. The fire access door uses a mechanical key, not a code. There are 3 copies of that key. I have 1. The operations manager has 1. Third, he stopped. Where? Elena said. Patterson, he said. They both looked at the security booth. Patterson was gone. The booth was empty. The gate was up. The orange light burned above nothing. Roman moved first. The east entrance was a personnel door beside the main vehicle gate, a standard steel door with a keycard reader that had gone green when Roman held his card to it, which meant whoever had tried to lock down the building had not yet revoked his access credentials, or had not thought to, or had not had time. The door opened. Roman went through. Elena followed. He stopped immediately and turned. I'm not waiting on the access road alone, she said. Elena, you're 33, I know. She held his gaze. I know exactly what I am. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he turned and moved. The inside of Eastport Terminal at 11 at night was a different country from what it was during operational hours. The loading areas were lit by overhead security, lighting bright enough to work by, cold and directionless. The sound was mechanical. Ventilation, the distant complaint of something metal, adjusting in the temperature change, the water sounds of the harbor against the terminal's exterior walls. Elena had never been inside Eastport before. She'd seen the plans Roman had shown her once, some early dinner conversation about expansion, the architectural drawings spread on their dining table, And she found herself using those remembered drawings now, the spatial layout assembling itself against the physical reality as she followed Roman through the first corridor. He walked fast. She kept up. Her back was burning, had been burning since she got out of the cab, the specific low ache that had been her constant companion for 6 weeks, and she breathed through it and kept her eyes on the corridor ahead. Loading dock B is left at the end of this corridor, Roman said without turning. Fire access door is 20 meters past the dock entrance. Patterson took the mechanical key, a sound. Both of them stopped. It was a footstep, not close somewhere ahead and to the left, in the section before the dock entrance. One footstep and then silence, and then the specific quiet of someone else, also stopping. Roman's hand went out, touching her arm once stay, and then he moved forward alone, past the dock entrance, into the corridor beyond. Elena stayed where she was for approximately 4 seconds. Then she moved to the dock entrance and looked through. Loading dock B was a large open space concrete floor, industrial shelving on 3 walls, the dock doors closed and locked for the night. In the center of the space, 2 folding tables had been set up and covered with document boxes. The acquisition filing, she understood. Everything Vane had needed to be positioned here. The far wall, in front of the fire access door, Patterson stood with his back to her. He had the mechanical key in the lock, and beside him, holding the black authentication device, the key that had moved from Celeste's safe to Celeste's coat to somewhere Elena hadn't been able to track, was a man she didn't recognize. Younger, compact, wearing the jacket of a terminal logistics employee. Vane's inside man. The man had been here before tonight. Positioned. Waiting, Patterson had the door open now. The inside man was moving toward it, and on the other side of that door was the operations office, and in the operations office was the authentication terminal that Vittorio had moved. A figure came around the far end of the shelving. Roman. He had come through a different route through, a side access she hadn't seen, and he was standing at the far end of the dock with his hands visible and his voice already in motion before either Patterson or the inside man fully processed that he was there. Patterson, Roman said. Put the key down. Patterson turned. The inside man turned. 2 people caught mid-action, and the specific frozen quality of that moment, the half second where everyone assessed and nobody moved, lasted exactly as long as it took the inside man to decide that Roman Vescari, standing between him and the exit, was a solvable problem. He went through the fire access door. Roman crossed the dock in 6 strides. Elena was already moving through the dock entrance. Patterson turned toward her. Not threatening, she realized. Just startled, and she stopped, and they looked at each other. And Patterson's face had the expression of a man who had made a decision earlier tonight that he was currently deeply reconsidering. How much did he pay you? Elena said. Patterson's mouth worked. I didn't, it wasn't. How much? 20,000, he said. Cash. To move the terminal and give him the fire key. He looked past her toward the fire door where Roman had gone through. I didn't know what he was using it for. I thought it was a corporate dispute. It is, Elena said. Just not the kind you come back from easily. She looked at him. You're going to stay here. You're going to wait. And when the federal agents arrive, and they will arrive, you're going to tell them everything you just told me. I could lose my... You'll definitely lose your job, Elena said. Question is whether that's all you lose. She held his gaze. Stay here. She went through the fire access door. The operations corridor was narrower than the dock utility space. Pipes overhead, the floor bare concrete worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. The authentication terminal was in the operations office at the corridor's end, behind a door with a standard lock, and the door was open. Roman was in the doorway. The inside man was at the terminal. The authentication device was already connected. Elena came up behind Roman and looked past his shoulder and understood in 1 second that they were 4 seconds too late. The device was inserted. The terminal screen was active. The authentication sequence was running. And the inside man had his hand on the device and was watching the progress bar with the focused attentions of someone executing a task he'd rehearsed. Roman went through the door. The inside man looked up. He was younger than Elena had thought, mid-20s, with a particular flat expression of someone who had been trained to complete tasks without emotional interference. He looked at Roman the way you looked at a variable you'd been briefed on. Get away from the terminal, Roman said. 20 seconds, the inside man said. Not to Roman. To himself or to whoever was on the other end of the earpiece, Elena could now see in his left ear. Roman crossed the room in 3 steps and reached for the device. The inside man moved fast, trained, the specific economy of someone who knew how to use their body as a tool, and Roman took the impact across the shoulder and went sideways into the equipment rack along the wall. Metal on metal, a sound that rang in the confined space. Roman caught himself against the rack and came back without pause, and Elena, standing in the doorway, watched her former husband fight a man 15 years younger in a room the size of a large closet and thought with a specific, irrational clarity, "He's going to get hurt, and it's going to be my fault for calling him here." The inside man had the terminal between himself and Roman now, using it as a barrier. Progress bar was at 70%, 80. Roman looked at the terminal. He looked at the inside man. He looked at the power cable running from the terminal to the wall outlet behind the equipment rack. He looked at Elena. She was already moving. She came through the door, past Roman, past the inside man who was focused on Roman, and she got to the equipment rack, and she pulled the power cable out of the wall. The terminal screen went dark. The authentication device made a sound, a brief electronic protest, and the progress bar disappeared. The room went very quiet. The inside man stared at the blank screen. He said something into his earpiece short, clipped, a single sentence Elena didn't catch. Then he looked at her coat, at her pregnancy, at the power cable in her hand. His expression moved through several things in quick succession. 93%, he said. It was at 93. It needed 100, Elena said. He looked at her for another second. Then he pulled the authentication device from the terminal and moved toward the door. Roman blocked the door. "That device is evidence in a federal investigation," Roman said. "You walk out with it. You're transporting evidence. You're done." The inside man looked at him. "Move," he said. "No," Roman said. 3 seconds. The inside man ran the calculation Roman's size, his own training, the authentication device in his hand, the corridor behind Roman, and Elena watched him run it and saw the moment he decided that the device in his hand was not worth what completing this task would cost him, now that the authentication had failed. He held it out. Roman took it. The inside man walked past him into the corridor, and Elena heard his footsteps moving fast away, and then the sound of the fire access door, and then nothing. Roman stood in the doorway with the authentication device in his hand. He looked at it. He turned it over once. He looked up at Elena. She was breathing hard. She hadn't realized how hard until the room went quiet and she could hear herself, the specific rapid breathing of exertion and adrenaline. Her hand pressed against the equipment rack because her back had gone from burning to a harder, more insistent pain during the last 2 minutes. Elena Roman's voice changed. He crossed the room. "I'm fine," she straightened. She was not entirely fine. The pain in her back was doing something it hadn't done before, radiating, moving, a quality to it that was different from the chronic ache she'd been managing for weeks. "I'm fine. Is it over?" The authentication failed. Without a complete sequence, the acquisition filing, can't, he stopped. He was looking at her face. "You're not fine, Roman. You're white." She stopped because the pain moved again, lower this time, and her breath caught. Roman's hand was on her arm. "How long has it been doing that?" he said. "Just the back thing. I've had it for—" "That's not your back," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. She felt it again. Not pain exactly. More like pressure. A long, slow wave of it moving through her abdomen. And she thought, no. Not now. This is not the moment. Her body did not care about the moment. "I need to call Margot," she said. "You need to call your doctor," Roman said. "Right now." "The device, I have the device." His voice was very controlled. The specific control of a man managing his own alarm. "Elena, how far apart? I don't know. I wasn't tracking." "Guess." She thought about the access road, the dock entrance, the operations corridor. She thought about the pain at each point and tried to put time between them and couldn't do it precisely. "I don't know," she said again. "Maybe 6 minutes. Maybe 5. Roman already had his phone out. He called 911. He gave the address Eastport Terminal, East Entrance, Operations Corridor, and said the words "pregnant woman, 33 weeks, possible early labor in the same flat," specific voice he'd used to call the operations manager. And Elena stood against the equipment rack and breathed through the next wave and thought, 33 weeks. 5 weeks early. Noah is not supposed to be here yet. From somewhere else in the terminal, she heard voices, multiple voices, and then footsteps that had the specific rhythm of coordinated entry, not one person but several. And Roman looked up from his phone and said quietly, almost to himself, "Federal." They came into the corridor 30 seconds later, 4 agents in jackets with letters on the back, and behind them the operations manager Roman had called, and behind him, improbably, Margot Hale in a coat that suggested she had left the house very fast. Margot took one look at Elena and crossed the corridor in 4 steps. "How far apart?" Margot said. "Everyone keeps asking me that," Elena said. "'Cause it matters." Margot's hand was on her arm, steadying. "The ambulance?" "Called," Roman said. One of the agents older, with the face of a man who had been doing this long enough that almost nothing surprised him, looked at Roman. He looked at the authentication device in Roman's hand. He looked at Elena. "Roman Vescari," he said. "Yes," Roman said. "You want to tell me what I'm looking at?" Roman held up the authentication device. "This is the key to an acquisition filing for Eastport Terminal. The filing was engineered using assets stolen from a protected family trust. The authentication sequence was interrupted approximately 4 minutes ago." He paused. "The archive that was transmitted to your division this afternoon will document all of it, including my role in it." The agent looked at him for a moment. "Including your role," the agent said. "Yes," Roman said. Another wave hit Elena. She made a sound she hadn't meant to make, a sharp, involuntary sound, and Margot's arm came around her, and Roman was there too, on the other side. She was suddenly supported by 2 people. She had not expected to be standing on either side of her in an operations corridor in a cargo terminal at 11:30 at night. "The ambulance is 4 minutes out," said someone with a radio. "I need to sit down," Elena said. Roman and Margot moved her to the corridor wall. She sat down on the cold concrete floor, with her back against the wall and her knees up, and she breathed and watched the federal agents move through the operations office and thought about Noah. About 33 weeks, 5 weeks too early, 5 weeks of development not yet complete, and she thought about all the things she had not been afraid of during the last 6 weeks, all the risks she had calculated and accepted, and felt afraid for the first time. Not for herself. "He's going to be okay," Roman said. She looked up at him. He was crouched beside her on the concrete floor of the corridor, the authentication device handed off to an agent, both hands free now. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said, "but I'm saying it anyway." She looked at him, at the specific reality of him. Crouched on a concrete floor in a cargo terminal, with his suit jacket dusty from the equipment rack, and his shoulder going to bruise where he'd taken the impact, and his face doing the thing it had done earlier, the stripped-down thing without the management layers. And she thought, "This is the most honest he has ever been with me." The thought arrived without softness and without bitterness, just as information. Just as a fact about the 3 years she had spent in a marble penthouse with a man who had treated their marriage as a strategic position, and the 1 hour in a cargo terminal at 33 weeks pregnant that had apparently done what 3 years hadn't. It didn't fix anything. It didn't change what he had done or what was coming for him. But it was real, and real was something. Another wave. Longer this time. "Talk to me," she said through it. "About something. Anything." Roman sat down on the concrete floor beside her. He thought for a second. "When I looked at the Eastport blueprints the first time," he said, "I was 27. Terminal was a mess. Nothing was load-bearing where it should have been. 3 different architects, 3 different eras, none of them talking to each other." He paused. "It took me 6 months to understand the structure underneath all the additions. Was actually holding it up." Elena breathed. "What was?" "The original 1940s frame, buried under everything else. Everything that had been added on was either redundant or decorative. The real structure was the first one." The wave eased. She let her head rest against the wall. "That's not a bad story," she said. "I have a few," he said. From outside, she heard the ambulance. Roman stood. He looked down at her for a moment, at the floor, at Margot on Elena's other side, at the federal agents moving through the office behind them, and she saw him absorbing the full reality of what the next several hours were going to look like. The ambulance, the agents, the authentication device and evidence, the archive in the FBI system, Vittorio's confession, his own words on an access road to a federal agent, including my role in it. She saw him understand that there was no version of tonight that ended with his empire intact. She saw him decide something. She didn't know exactly what he decided. She would think about it later in the hospital, in the weeks after. And she would never be completely certain whether it was something genuine or something strategic. And she would eventually conclude that the distinction might not matter as much as the choice itself. He held out his hand to Margot. "Take care of her," he said. Margot took his meaning, the physical meaning, the steadying of Elena as she moved toward standing, and nodded. Roman walked to the senior federal agent. He stood in front of the man with his hands at his sides, open, not performing surrender, just standing where he was. "I'll give you a full statement," Roman said. "Everything. The asset transfers, the shell structure, the arrangement with Vane, the timeline." He paused. "My father's secondary ledger is 31 years long. Tell you what I know about it." The agent looked at him. "That's going to be a long statement," the agent said. "Yes," Roman said, "it is." The ambulance crew came through the east entrance with a stretcher, and Margot moved with Elena toward them. And Elena went willingly, without argument. For the first time in 6 weeks, simply letting someone else make the next decision. And as the crew settled her onto the stretcher and asked her questions, she answered in a voice that was steadier than she expected. She turned her head once and looked back down the corridor. Roman was standing with the federal agent, talking. His voice was too low to hear from this distance. His posture was the posture of a man giving information rather than managing it. Stretcher moved. The corridor passed overhead pipe and light, and the industrial ceiling of a terminal that had been built in 1947 and had survived everything thrown at it since, and Elena closed her eyes and felt Noah press against her ribs one more time, insistent. Impatient, a small body making its intentions known 5 weeks ahead of schedule. Hold on, she thought. Just a little longer. The night air hit her face as they came through the east entrance, cold and salt-sharp, and she looked up at the sky above the harbor dark and specific and indifferent to everything that had just happened in the building behind her, and she breathed it in and thought, "It's done. Whatever comes next, the worst of it is done." She believed it. She would be wrong about the timing by approximately 47 minutes, which was how long it would take the doctors at Boston General to tell her that Noah was coming tonight whether anyone was ready or not, and that ready or not was not a variable anyone in that delivery room was going to have the luxury of managing. But she believed it in the moment, on the stretcher, under the harbor sky. And sometimes what you believe in the moment is the only thing that carries you through to what comes after. Noah Vescari was born at 2:47 in the morning. He came into the world 5 weeks early and furious about it, a small, red, deeply indignant person who announced his arrival with a cry that Elena heard before she fully understood she was hearing it, her brain still somewhere in the last hour of effort, still in the specific tunnel of labor that narrows everything down to breath and endurance and the particular animal certainty that you will survive this because you have no other option. Then the cry, and everything else fell away. She had prepared herself in the controlled and systematic way. She prepared herself for most things, for the possibility that she would not hear it immediately. 33 weeks. The NICU team was in the room, had been in the room since she arrived. 8 people for 2 patients, all of them moving, with the particular focused efficiency of people who did this for a living and had learned to do it without broadcasting alarm. She had prepared herself for silence and for the careful face of a neonatologist about to deliver information. She was not prepared for the cry. It was small, indignant, absolutely certain of its own existence. Elena said a sound she had never made before in her life and could not have described afterward. Not a word, not quite a sob. Something more fundamental than either. Something that came from a place in her body, hadn't known existed until that moment. Her hand was shaking. She realized it was shaking when the nurse took it and held it, and she looked at the nurse's face. And the nurse was saying something she couldn't hear because of the sound in her own ears. And then the neonatologist was saying something, and then someone put Noah against her chest. He was so small. She had known he would be small. She had read every developmental chart, had known the exact weight range for 33 weeks, had prepared herself intellectually for the reality of a premature infant. None of it had prepared her for the specific weight of him lighter than she'd imagined, lighter than felt possible, but undeniably real, undeniably present, making small sounds against her chest that were not quite crying anymore, but something between crying and breathing, the sounds of a person adjusting to a world they had arrived in ahead of schedule. "He's breathing on his own," the neonatologist said. Elena heard it this time. "He's small, but he's breathing. We're going to take him to the NICU and get him stable." But a pause. "Strong." Elena looked at Noah's face, at the specific, scrunched, ancient-looking face of a newborn who had not wanted to wait 5 more weeks and had made his position on that matter completely clear. "I know," she said. She said it to the neonatologist. She said it to the room. She said it to herself and to Noah, and to the 6 weeks of careful, exhausting work that had brought her to this specific moment on this specific night. "I know," she said again. "He's strong." They took him to the NICU at 3 in the morning. Elena lay in the delivery room after and looked at the ceiling and breathed and thought about nothing at all for approximately 4 minutes. The nothing was deliberate. She had earned the nothing. Then she asked the nurse for her phone. Margot was in the waiting room. She had been there since the ambulance arrived, and she was still in her coat, still with the specific alertness of a woman who had not slept and was not going to sleep until she had information. "Boy, 4 pounds to his NICU, breathing alone." "I'm okay." Margot read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket. She sat in the waiting room chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and breathed for a moment. Then she called the federal agent, the senior one, whose card she'd taken at the terminal, and left a message telling him that the primary witness in the trust matter had delivered prematurely and was currently at Boston General and would not be available for a statement for at least 48 hours, and that he could direct any questions to her office. Then she sat back down and waited, because waiting was what the situation called for, and Margot Hale had spent 40 years doing what situations called for. At 4:15, Roman arrived. He came through the main entrance with a federal agent walking beside him, not restraining him, not handcuffed, but present in the deliberate way of someone whose job was to be present, and Margot stood up when she saw him. He looked at her. "She's okay," Margot said. Something moved through his face. "And the baby. 4 pounds 2 ounces, NICU, breathing independently." Roman nodded. He nodded again, which was one too many times, for information he'd already processed, and Margot understood that the second nod was something else, a private thing, an internal adjustment she wasn't meant to read. "Can I?" He stopped. He looked at the federal agent. The agent made a slight gesture, not a yes, not a no, the gesture of someone willing to allow reasonable human behavior within the constraints of a situation. Roman looked back at Margot. "Is she asking for anyone?" "She hasn't asked for anyone," Margot said. "She texted me. She hasn't called anyone." Roman stopped again. He sat down in the chair across from Margot, with the particular heaviness of a man who had been running on adrenaline for 5 hours and had just run out. "That's very Elena." "Yes," Margot said. "It is." They sat across from each other in the hospital waiting room at 4:15 in the morning and said nothing for a while, which was also appropriate to the situation. The NICU nurse's name was Carmen. She had been doing this work for 19 years and had the particular warmth of someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where people were terrified and had learned exactly how to be present in those rooms without making the terror larger. She showed Elena how to reach through the incubator's side opening. She showed her how to hold her hand still, not to stroke, just to rest, to let Noah feel the warmth of skin without the stimulation of movement. Alinsa sat beside the incubator at 5 in the morning with her hand through the opening and her palm resting against Noah's back and felt his breathing under her hand. Small breaths, fast the way premature infants breathed, the respiratory rate higher than it would be at full term. Steady, consistent. "He's doing well," Carmen said from the other side of the incubator. "For 33 weeks he's doing really well. He's been doing well since before he was born," Elena said. Carmen smiled. "They surprise you." Elena looked at Noah's face, the scrunched eyes, the small working mouth, the particular concentration of a new person, focused entirely on the task of existing. She thought about the night she'd sat at the kitchen island with the silver pen, and her ankles swollen, and her husband laughing into a phone 15 feet away, and she thought about the 6 weeks since, and she thought about the access road, and the cargo terminal, and the authentication device in Roman's hands, which had not been steady. And then she stopped thinking about all of it, because Noah's breathing changed slightly under her palm. A small shift, a settling, and she focused on that instead. Just that. Just him. Breathing. The investigation moved the way federal investigations moved, with the specific, inexorable slowness of an institution that had been designed to be thorough rather than fast. By Monday morning, the asset freeze was complete. By Wednesday, the acquisition filing had been formally invalidated. By Friday, the preliminary indictments had named 4 individuals: Silas Vane, a financial associate of Vane's, Roman Vescari, and Vittorio Vescari. Celeste Rourke was not among the indicted. Celeste had spent Sunday at the federal building on Cambridge Street, giving a statement that lasted 11 hours. She had a lawyer, a very good one, retained so quickly that Margot privately noted it suggested prior preparation, and she had cooperated completely, methodically, and with the specific thoroughness of a woman who had decided that cooperation was her only exit from a situation she had helped build. She gave them Vane's full operational structure. She gave them the shell corporations, the intermediary companies, the 3-year paper trail of the Eastport scheme. She gave them her own role, the conduit, the keyholder, the knowing participant, without minimizing and without embellishing. She received a plea agreement. Elena found out about the plea agreement on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after Noah's birth, sitting in the NICU family lounge with a cup of bad coffee and a phone call from Margot. She listened to the terms. She said nothing for a moment. "It's a reasonable outcome," Margot said carefully. "I know," Elena said. She gave them Vane. Without her testimony, Vane's attorneys. "I know, Margot." Elena looked at the door of the lounge, through the small window in it, at the NICU corridor beyond. "I'm not fighting it. She stopped. I want her to understand what she was part of. Not as a legal matter, as a human matter. That's not something a plea agreement can require." "No," Elena said. "It isn't." She ended the call and sat with her bad coffee and thought about Celeste, not with hatred, which was too exhausting to maintain, but with something cooler and more specific. The woman who had laughed. She doesn't know what she doesn't know. The comfortable laugh of someone so accustomed to being inside the structure of power that other people's blindness had become unremarkable. Elena hoped the 11-hour statement had been uncomfortable. She suspected it had been. Noah came home 18 days after he was born. He came home at 5 pounds 4 ounces, which was progress measured in fractions of pounds, but felt like enormous distance from where he'd started. Elena had spent 18 days driving to the hospital twice daily, sitting beside the incubator, learning the specific vocabulary of NICU monitoring O2 saturation, respiratory rate, particular sound of the alarms that mattered versus the ones that usually resolved on their own. The vocabulary became ordinary, and the ordinary became the structure she lived inside. The day they discharged him, Carmen was working. "You're ready," Carmen said, watching Elena secure Noah into the infant carrier, with the careful focus of someone who had practiced the motion 30 times and was still not confident. "I don't think ready is the right word," Elena said. "No," Carmen agreed. "It never is." Elena drove home to the Komev property, the brownstone she had listed in the divorce papers, the one that had been hers before Roman and had remained hers through the agreement, with Noah in the rear-facing car seat and the radio off and both hands on the wheel. She drove at exactly the speed limit. She stopped at yellow lights. She was aware of being, in that specific moment, the most careful driver in the city of Boston. She brought him inside. She sat in the chair she'd moved from her old apartment, not the designer furniture from the penthouse, which she had left completely, but her own chair, the one she'd had since she was 24, reupholstered twice. The frame's solid and slightly imperfect, and she held Noah in the afternoon light, coming through the bay window, and thought, this is what it was for. Not the divorce, not the recordings, not the terminal and the authentication device, and the federal investigation. This, the afternoon light, the weight of him, the specific smell of him, which no one had ever found the right word for, and which Elena would never attempt to find the right word for, because some things resisted language, and that was fine. This Vittorio pled guilty in the spring. His attorney negotiated on the basis of his age, his cooperation, and the 31-year scope of his secondary ledger, which turned out to be more complex and more self-serving than his phone call to Roman had suggested, but also, in its complexity, more useful to the federal case than anyone had initially expected. He received a suspended sentence, house arrest, permanent exclusion from any fiduciary role in the Vescari trust structure. Elena learned about the sentence from Margot and said nothing for a long moment and then said, he sabotaged the authentication terminal. He sent the Federal Archive. Those things happened because of him. Yes, Margot said. And he spent 31 years operating a secondary ledger that helped create the conditions for everything that followed. Also, yes. So I have to hold both of those things at the same time. Welcome to adulthood, Margot said, with the dryness of a woman who had been holding contradictory truths about the same people for 4 decades. Elena removed Vittorio from the trust's advisory structure. She did it formally through Margot, with documentation that made the reasoning explicit. She did not speak to Vittorio directly for several months after that. When she finally did, at a meeting about the trust restructuring, which she had requested, and which he had attended with the careful posture of a man who had accepted a diminished role, she said what she needed to say plainly and without performance. "You made choices that had consequences for a lot of people," she told him. "Some of those choices, at the end, bent towards something better. I'm not going to pretend that balances the rest, but I'm also not going to pretend the end didn't happen." Vittorio looked at his hands. He was older than he had looked 8 months ago. That happened sometimes. Elena had noticed people aged in visible increments when the structures they'd been leaning on collapsed. He said, "I'm telling you this because you're Noah's grandfather," Elena said, "and I intend for Noah to have a relationship with you on appropriate terms, when he's old enough to understand what those terms mean." Vittorio looked up. "That's more than I expected," he said. "I know," Elena said. "Don't make me regret it." She meant it. He understood she meant it. The meeting proceeded to the trust restructuring documents, and Elena signed what needed to be signed, and Vittorio signed what needed to be signed, and Margot witnessed it, and the afternoon moved on. Roman received a federal sentence of 4 years. He reported to a minimum security facility in Connecticut in October. He had, in the 8 months between the night at Eastport and his sentencing, done several things that Elena noted without commenting on publicly. He had paid full restitution to the trust, which restored Noah's protected asset base entirely. He had provided testimony that was, by the federal prosecutor's account, the single most useful piece of cooperation in the Vane case, and he had not, in 8 months, attempted to use his name or his attorneys or any mechanism of his former influence to gain access to Noah beyond what Elena permitted. What Elena permitted in those 8 months was supervised visits. Once a week, 2 hours. She had not been in the room for those visits. She had sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away and read or worked or stared at nothing for 2 hours and then driven back and picked up Noah from the supervised visitation center and driven home. She did not ask Noah what had happened during the visits because Noah was 8 months old and could not answer, but she watched his face when she picked him up, and his face was always the face of a child who had been fed and held and not distressed. That was sufficient, for now. The week before Roman reported to Connecticut, he called Elena. She answered. "I wanted to say—" He stopped. She could hear him choosing. "I don't have a word for what I want to say." "Then don't try to find one," Elena said. "I need to try." She waited. "I looked at the wrong things," Roman said. "For a long time. I knew how to look at a company and see what it was worth, and what it would cost to acquire it, and what the leverage points were. I looked at everything that way, including—" He stopped again. "I didn't know I was doing it with you until I wasn't able to do it anymore." "What changed?" Elena said. "You signed the papers." She was quiet. "When you signed and walked out," Roman said, "I told myself you were giving up. I built a whole story around that. And then I started finding the edges of the story places where it didn't hold, and then the terminal, and then everything after. And then I was sitting in a federal interview room at 6 in the morning giving a statement, and I thought, a pause. I thought she didn't give up." She finished. Elena looked at the window. Noah was asleep in the next room. She could see the monitor light, the steady green pulse of it. "You'll have 4 years," she said. "Yes. When you're done, you can apply to expand the visit schedule. Through Margot's office. The terms are written into the custody agreement." She paused. "Not because of what you did at the terminal. Not as a reward. Because Noah deserves to know you, if you're willing to be worth knowing." "Silence, I understand," Roman said. "Consistency," Elena said. "That's the only thing that counts." "I know." "Okay." She looked at the monitor light. "Okay, Roman." She ended the call. She sat in the quiet of the Comav brownstone and listened to the city out's specific sound of Boston. On an October evening, traffic and wind, and the distant sound of something that might have been music from the bar 2 blocks over, and she thought about the silver pen. The restructuring of Vescari Holdings took 14 months. Elena did not do it alone. She had Margot, she had the trustees. She had a firm of independent advisors who had been brought in specifically because they had no prior relationship with the Vescari structure, and therefore no stake in preserving it. She had unexpectedly 3 senior Eastport managers who had spent the months since the acquisition attempt building a worker representation committee, and who arrived at one of the restructuring meetings with a 20-page proposal for a cooperative governance model that, was Elena thought, reading it at the Com-Av kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night while Noah slept, one of the most well-constructed documents she had encountered, since Margot had put the trust agreement in front of her 14 months ago. She called the committee's lead contact in the morning. "I've read it," she said. A pause on the other end. "And? It needs work in sections 4 and 7. The liability structure in section 4 has a gap that would create problems in an asset dispute. Section 7's governance timeline is too optimistic. You're assuming board appointments can happen in 90 days, and that's not realistic with the trust oversight requirements." Another pause. But the framework is sound," Elena said. "And the worker equity provisions are better than anything I'd seen drafted in this sector." She paused. "Let's meet Thursday." They met Thursday, and the Thursday after that. And for 6 months of Thursdays after that, working through the restructuring document, section by section, building something that was not the Vescari Empire Roman had built, and was not the thing Silas Vane had wanted to strip for parts. Something different. Something with worker protections written into the governance structure, and a permanent family trust for Noah's benefit, and an independent board that answered to the trust rather than to any single operational authority. Elena was offered the chairman's seat. She declined. The woman who eventually took the chairman's seat was a logistics executive named Patricia Osei, who had spent 12 years running a shipping operation in Baltimore and had no prior connection to the Vescari family, and had looked at the restructuring documents and said, in her first meeting with Elena, "This is either the most idealistic corporate governance structure I've ever seen or the most carefully designed." "Tell me which one it is, both," Elena said. Patricia had looked at her for a moment. "Fair enough," she said. Patricia was good. Elena watched her work for the first 6 months and concluded that good was in fact the right word. Not brilliant, not visionary, but competent and honest and willing to hear things she didn't want to hear, without making the messenger pay for it, which was rarer than it should have been. Eastport stayed open. Frank Delgado, 22 years of service, became the worker representative on the independent board. Elena had not sought him out. She had found his name on the committee proposal, in the section listing the working group members, and had recognized it, and stopped and sat with the coincidence, the smallness of the city, specific way things connected, for a moment before continuing to read. She did not tell him she'd read his name on the employee list at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night in a hotel room 2 weeks, before his terminal almost changed ownership. She didn't need to. The silver pen. She found it at the bottom of the bag she'd packed, the night she left the penthouse. She'd forgotten it was there, had packed it that night in the specific automatic of someone whose hands were moving while her mind was somewhere else, sweeping the kitchen counter clear into the bag, and the pen had come with it. It was a good pen. She'd bought it herself 7 years ago, in a shop on Newbury Street. Not expensive, but not cheap. It wrote cleanly. She used it to sign the final restructuring agreement on a Tuesday in March, 14 months after the night at the terminal, 11 months after Noah had come home, in Margot's conference room, with the afternoon light coming through the 14th floor windows at an angle that put the whole table in a kind of ordinary gold. Margot signed as witness. Patricia signed as incoming chairman. The independent board members signed. The trustees signed. Noah, who was 11 months old and had spent the meeting attempting to eat a corner of a manila folder and being gently redirected, did not sign. Elena signed last. Her hand was steady. It had been steady the night she'd signed the divorce papers. It had been steady in the hotel room. It had been steady on the access road outside Eastport when Silas Vane had explained, pleasantly, why she could not stop what was already in motion. She put the pen down on the table beside the signed agreement. She looked at it for a moment. Margot, gathering documents at the other end of the table, glanced over. She saw Elena looking at the pen. She said nothing. I'm going to get lunch, Elena said. Is there anything else today? Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow, Margot said. Elena picked up Noah from the floor, where he had moved on to examining the base of a chair leg with the focused intensity that characterized his approach to most stationary objects. He looked up at her when she lifted him surprised, briefly indignant, then curious, his face cycling through its small repertoire of expressions with the speed of a child who had not learned to manage what showed. He had Roman's eyes. She had known that since the first week and had sat with the knowledge and turned it over and decided that it was a fact, not a verdict. He had Roman's eyes and her mother's chin and an expression when he concentrated that did not belong to anyone she could identify, that was simply his, already specific and already his. Hi, she said to him. He grabbed her collar. Okay, she said. She said goodbye to Margot, gathered the diaper bag and her coat, and walked out of the conference room and through the 14th floor office and into the elevator. She pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. In the elevator mirror, she looked at herself, her face, her coat, Noah against her shoulder, and she looked like exactly what she was, a 34-year-old woman who had been through something hard and was on the other side of it. Not unmarked, not unchanged, but upright, present. Here, the elevator doors opened. She walked through the lobby and out onto the street, and the March air was cold and specific the way Boston March always was, not quite winter, not quite anything else. The season refusing to commit, and she turned toward the parking garage and walked. Noah's hand was in her collar. His weight was against her shoulder. The street was ordinary around her lunch crowd, delivery bikes, 2 pigeons arguing over something on the curb, and she moved through it the way you moved through ordinary things, when ordinary had become, after a long time of not being ordinary, the best possible version of a day. The first supervised visit after Roman's release happened on a Thursday afternoon in autumn, 4 years and 3 months after the night. Elena had walked out of the penthouse with 1 suitcase and a silver pen at the bottom of her bag. Noah was 4 years old. He had his father's eyes and his own particular temperament, curious, stubborn, specific in his preferences, prone to long silences followed by detailed observations about whatever he had been quietly thinking about. He had not been told the full story of his parents' marriage. He had been told, in the language of a 4-year-old, that his father had made mistakes and had gone away for a while and was back now, and that back now meant slow, and that slow meant 1 afternoon at a time. Elena had not been in the room. She waited in the parking lot of the community center where the visitation happened. Not a coffee shop 2 blocks away, not anymore, but close enough to be reachable in 2 minutes. She sat in her car with the windows cracked and a book she didn't read and watched the door of the community center. 40 minutes in, her phone buzzed. The visitation coordinator, going well. He showed his dad a drawing he made. Elena put her phone face down on the passenger seat. She looked at the sky. It was the particular blue of an autumn afternoon in New England, deep and specific, the blue that only happened when the air was cold and clear simultaneously. She had always liked that blue. She had liked it as a kid in South Boston, looking up between buildings, and she liked it now. She picked up her book. She read 2 pages. She put it down. At the end of the hour, she walked to the entrance. Roman was crouched in the entryway when she pushed the door open. Crouched at Noah's level, examining something Noah was holding out to him. A small blue toy truck she saw, the kind with the cab that pivoted, one of Noah's current obsessions. Something was wrong with the pivot mechanism. Noah was explaining this with the earnestness of a 4-year-old who has encountered an engineering problem that requires adult attention. Roman was listening, not performing listening. Listening the way he had listened to Vittorio on the phone in the access road outside the terminal, with the actual attention of a man who had stopped constructing responses and was just receiving what was coming. The part here, Noah said, pointing. It's stuck. Can you let me see, Roman said. He took the truck. He turned it over in his hands. He examined the pivot joint with the focused attention of a man who was going to solve this particular problem, before he stood up. Elena stood in the doorway and watched. Roman worked the joint carefully with his thumbnail, working at whatever had jammed it, and after a moment something released, and the cab pivoted freely. Try it, Roman said. Noah grabbed the truck. He pivoted the cab. Pivoted it back. He pivoted it again, with the focused repetition of a child verifying that a thing works before committing to the belief that it works. It worked. Noah looked up. He held the truck up toward Elena across the entryway. "You fixed it," Noah said. Elena looked at her son's face, the delight in it, the simple, uncomplicated delight of a child whose truck had been broken and was now fixed. And she looked at Roman, who was standing now, who was looking at her with the expression he'd had in the operations corridor, at the terminal, the stripped-down expression without the management layers. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. "Can we go get hot chocolate?" Noah said. "You said maybe?" "I said maybe," Elena confirmed. "Let me check the time." She checked her phone, not because she needed to check the time, but because she needed a moment to look at something that wasn't Roman's face or Noah's face, to let the moment settle to a size she could manage. "Yes," she said. "We can get hot chocolate." Noah moved toward the door with the focused momentum of a 4-year-old who has received permission and is now executing on it. Elena held the door. He went through. She looked back at Roman. "Thank you," he said. For he stopped. He found the words. "For the truck. For letting me try." "One afternoon at a time," Elena said. "Yes," he said. She went out into the autumn blue after her son. The door closed behind her. Noah was already at the sidewalk, truck in hand, looking back at her with the expression of a child who has decided that hot chocolate is a time-sensitive matter, and that adults move too slowly in general. "Come on," he said. "I'm coming," Elena said. She crossed the entryway to the sidewalk, and Noah took her hand, his small hand, already with its specific grip that she knew the exact weight and temperature of the way she knew her own name. And they walked down the street together in the particular afternoon light of an autumn day in a city that kept moving regardless of what happened inside any individual life within it. Elena did not look back at the community center. She had not taken Roman's empire. She had not replaced him. She had not become the person who lived in the marble penthouse with the harbor view and the enormous rooms designed to make other people feel small. Simply, in the end, reclaimed the thing that had been hers all along. The right to move through her own life without someone else's hands on the steering wheel. The silver pen was in her coat pocket. She hadn't put it there deliberately. It had migrated, over the months, from bag to desk to coat pocket to bag again, the way small objects moved through a life without being tracked. She felt the weight of it when Noah tugged her hand across the street, a small, familiar weight, unremarkable. Exactly the weight of a pen that wrote cleanly, and had signed the things that needed signing and would sign whatever came next. Her hand, as always, was steady. The hot chocolate place was 3 blocks from the community center, on a corner that Noah had decided, sometime in the last month, was his favorite corner in the city. Elena had not asked why. She had learned, with 4-year-olds, that why was sometimes the wrong question, that the reasons were either too simple to need articulation or too complex to survive it, and that the right response to this is my favorite corner was simply to acknowledge that it was, in fact, a good corner. Good corner. A bakery on one side, the hot chocolate place on the other, a maple tree in the sidewalk cut that had gone the specific burning orange of peak October. Noah stopped under the tree on the way in, the way he always stopped, and looked up through the branches at the sky. "It's the same blue," he said. "Same as what?" Elena asked. Same as before he considered this, same as always. She looked up. The blue between the orange branches was, in fact, the same blue it had been when she'd looked at it in the parking lot deep and cold and specific. "You're right," she said. "Same as always." He seemed satisfied with that confirmation. He went inside. The woman behind the counter knew Noah by order, if not by name, one small hot chocolate, extra marshmallows, in the cup with the lid, because Noah had opinions about cups with lids. She started making it when she saw him come through the door. Elena ordered a coffee she probably didn't need and paid, and found their usual table by the window. The one where Noah could see the maple tree and the street and whatever was happening on the corner, which was usually nothing, and which he watched with the focused interest of a child who had not yet learned to sort events by significance. He climbed into his chair. He arranged the truck on the table beside his cup. He looked at it. He was careful, Noah said. Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The truck? With everything. Noah touched the pivot joint with one finger, testing it. He kept asking if I wanted to show him things. Not telling me things. Asking. Elena looked at her son's face, at the particular thoughtfulness in it that arrived sometimes without warning, the expression that didn't belong to anyone she could identify, that was entirely his, already specific at 4 years old. "Did you like that?" she asked. Noah considered. he said. Some people tell you things too much? Some people do, Elena agreed. He picked up his hot chocolate with both hands and drank and got marshmallow on his upper lip and did not notice. And Elena did not tell him because the marshmallow would resolve itself and because there were moments that didn't need correcting. She looked out the window, the maple tree, the corner. Two people walking past with a dog that Noah would have commented on if he'd seen it, but he was focused on his truck again, on the pivot mechanism, moving it back and forth with the thumb and forefinger motion of someone verifying a repair. She thought about Roman, crouching in the entryway. She thought about the specific care with which he'd worked the joint, the thumbnail, the patience, the willingness to stay crouched on a community center floor, for however long the problem required. She thought about the 4 years in between, which she knew about only in outline, the facility, the GED tutoring he'd apparently volunteered for, the letters he had written to the Eastport Workers Fund, and which the fund's administrator had mentioned to her once carefully, gauging her reaction. She had not reacted. She had said, "I see," and moved on to the next item on the agenda. It was not her job to track his rehabilitation. It was not her job to assess it or validate it, or determine whether it was genuine or strategic, whether it was the real change of a man who had arrived at his limits, or the performed change of a man who understood that performance was now his most useful remaining tool. That was Noah's job eventually. Not now, now he was 4, and the relevant information was whether his truck got fixed and whether there were extra marshmallows. But eventually, when he was old enough to hold the full picture and decide for himself what it meant. Elena intended to give him the full picture when that time came. Not her version of it, smoothed into something easier to carry. The actual picture, the complicated, contradictory, fully human picture of a father who had done real damage and had also, at the end of a cargo terminal corridor at midnight, chosen to hand over an authentication device and walk toward a federal agent and tell the truth. Both things. All of it, without edits. She owed him that. Noah looked up from the truck. He had marshmallow on his lips still, and he had noticed now, and he was addressing it with a seriousness that the situation probably didn't require. "Mom," he said, "can we come back here on Saturday?" Elena looked at him, at the earnest, specific face of a child making a reasonable request and waiting for a reasonable answer. "Yes," she said. "With the same table? I'll ask." He nodded, satisfied, and returned to the truck. The pivot worked. He worked it again anyway, just to confirm, just to be sure. Outside the window, a couple walked past with a stroller, and a delivery truck idled at the corner, and the maple tree held its orange against the blue sky, with the patience of something that had done this every year. For longer than anyone on the street could remember, that would do it next year, and the year after, indifferent to everything happening beneath it, except the light in the season, and the particular requirements of being exactly what it was. Elena drank her coffee. She was 34 years old. She had a son who asked careful questions and noticed when the sky stayed the same color. She had work she understood, and people around her she had chosen rather than inherited. She had a brownstone on Com Ave with morning light through the bay window, and a chair she'd reupholstered twice, and a silver pen that had signed the things that needed signing. She did not have everything. She had lost things she had once thought were essential and had discovered, on the other side of losing them, that essential had been the wrong word. Useful, maybe. Familiar. The specific comfort of structures that hold you up even when they're not good for you, simply because they've been holding you up long enough that you've stopped questioning them. She had questioned them. She had stood in a hotel room at 33 weeks pregnant and decided that questioning was insufficient, that questioning without action was just a longer way of staying still. She had not stayed still. Noah finished his hot chocolate. He set the cup down. He looked at the marshmallow residue at the bottom with the expression of someone assessing whether more was forthcoming and concluding reluctantly that it was not. Picked up the truck. "Ready?" Elena said, almost. He pivoted the cab one more time. Satisfied, he wrapped both hands around the truck and looked at her. "Okay. Ready." She stood up. She helped him down from the chair. She held the door, and he went through it into the October afternoon, and she followed him out onto the corner, her son's favorite corner, the maple tree and the blue sky and the particular ordinary beauty of a city block on a Thursday afternoon in autumn. Noah held her hand. They walked.